Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, whatever you believe, whomever you love, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll, and this is our adult religious education class series in comparative religion. And today we're going to talk about Buddhism, part 7 in our Buddhist series. Isn't that great? We get these large numbers. Vajrayana Buddhism. And this is, like I said, this is part of a larger series, and we have a webpage for the course, sites.google.com, which is nice and free, /view comparative religion. And there you'll find links to all these videos, links to all the things I recommend. So I make recommended, extra, if you want to learn more, there's some extra books you can read, that sort of thing. Links to all the additional reading is there. As well as links to all the recordings for all these video lectures. If you miss one, they're on YouTube. We also have a calendar that tells you when the next class is going to be, because they float around during the month to correspond with my day off at work. They come in a different day every month, and so the calendar is useful to figure out when we're going to do the next one. So in our Buddhism series, in this comparative religion, we've had several parts. Part 1, we did the introduction and the life of the Buddha. In part 2, there was a short sermon on the 3 marks of existence, and then we expanded that to the teachings of the Buddha, all the numbered lists. In part 3, part 4, we talked about mindfulness and meditation 101, kind of how to meditate, that sort of thing. Part 5, we talked about Buddhism after the Buddha. So what happened to Buddhism after the Buddha died? And there, of course, we talked about especially the Theravada tradition and the monastic tradition and kind of the traditional Buddhist teaching, etc. Then we talked about Mahayana Buddhism, which is a kind of a reform Buddhism. That was last time, so we'll talk about that in a little more detail to kind of remember where we're at. And then today we're going to talk about Vajrayana Buddhism. So, Mahayana Buddhism. It can best be seen as a Buddhist version of the way of devotion, if you remember that from our Hinduism lecture. Last time we talked about the Lotus Sutra as one of the core texts of the Mahayana tradition. It was a text that was presumably found at a later date, that was presumably some of the secret teachings of the Buddha. So it claimed to go all the way back to the Buddha, but it's probably a much older text that claimed to be one of these secret teachings. It describes skillful means, the bodhisattva ideal, compassion, emptiness, and tells the parable of the burning building, where the building is on fire and the father wants the children to come out. So he promises them all sorts of shiny toys if they come out, and they come out. That's how he gets them out of the building. But once they're out, he says, no, I don't really have all these shiny toys. What I really have is one large, beautiful vehicle called the Mahayana, and that's what the Mahayana means, the great vehicle, and it is the one true teaching. And so the idea is this is a parable. The other ways, the other Buddhist traditions are these lesser vehicles that lure you out of the house, but once you get out, then you get the true teaching, the secret teaching, the Mahayana, the great vehicle. The bodhisattva ideal, of course, is this idea that people, instead of going straight to nirvana, they can circle back into samsara in order to bless others. And we enter the path through compassion and love of others and desire to help others find enlightenment for themselves, instead of just to seek enlightenment so that we can escape samsara. So that's kind of the major differences in the Mahayana tradition. If we look at kind of a map of Buddhism today, the major tradition in China is the Mahayana. And they represent, 53% of practitioners, and another 36% are Theravada. And that is that it is not identical to the earliest Buddhist tradition. All of these have evolved, but it is intentionally a conservative tradition that kind of rejects some of these later sutras, that teaches more of a monastic tradition centered on your own enlightenment, etc. And then the Theravada is what we see up in China. There's also a third school that we're going to talk about today, the Vajrayana. It's smaller. Only 6% of Buddhists are Vajrayana Buddhists. It is centered in Tibet and Mongolia. And so those are the main centers of Vajrayana Buddhism. So what is Vajrayana Buddhism? Well, this is because of Mahayana, the great vehicle, you get this idea of considering each path a different vehicle, a different cart you might take to go to the store. And the Vajrayana is the vehicle of the diamond or the thunderbolt. The idea being it produces a form of enlightenment that is as hard as a diamond and as sharp as a thunderbolt, and it breaks through all of the uncertainty and helps you realize enlightenment in a blinding flash. It's also sometimes called the Mantrayana, or the vehicle of the mantras, because it involves a lot of mantras. Mantras are these sacred syllables that you chant as part of your meditation practice. But what it really is, and I think this is an oversimplification, but I want to just, we have to oversimplify in order to just kind of get the high picture view sometimes, and then we can dive into the details. But one easy way to think of the Vajrayana is it is Mahayana Buddhism. It has all the hallmarks of Mahayana Buddhism, including the celestial Buddhas, the celestial Bodhisattvas, the belief in the Bodhisattva ideal, the focus on compassion. All that stuff from Mahayana Buddhism is there, and it adds to that the practice of Tantra. So it is essentially Tantric Buddhism. And of course, we've talked about Tantra as a practice before. We'll circle back on that. So Vajrayana. This is an image of the Dalai Lama, probably the most famous face of Buddhism today, and also a practitioner of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. And here he's in the process of laying down colored sand for a sound mandala, which we've talked about the sand mandalas before. And he's doing it, though, by rubbing a metal funnel with a scraper. The vibrations are what cause the sand to move out in a controlled manner, and he holds this female bell, the Ganta, in his left hand, and the masculine Vajra, the thunderbolt, in his right. So Vajrayana refers to the thunderbolt, and it's that thing he's holding in his right hand that he's scraping this thing with, this funnel that's creating the sand and making the sand to fall. It's Vajrayana, and it is the thunderbolt. It's also a representation of the masculine. And you can see that, right? It has a phallic implication. And the bell has a feminine implication. And it's this unification of the masculine and the feminine, which we will see in many other places in Vajrayana and Tantric Buddhism. We'll see that idea of the unification of the masculine and the feminine. And in these rituals of the Vajrayana Buddhism, you'll often see strike the bell with the striker. Now this is a singing bowl. But it's a slightly different idea, but you get the same idea. This is the masculine, this is the feminine, and when they strike, the sound is created, and the meditation is created. You meditate upon that sound. The interaction between the two is what creates the cause and effect world that of sensations and consciousness, and all that is created through the interactions of the two. It's again a similar idea to what we see in the Dalai Lama's hands here. Now, if the Vajrayana is Tantra plus Mahayana, what we need to figure out is what is Tantra, and kind of discuss that. Tantra is a pan-Indian phenomenon, though, of about the 6th century. So it's relatively late as religions go, but it's 6th century phenomenon throughout all of India. It's something that kind of happened in India, and all the religious traditions of India picked it up, and it's very similar in all these iterations. So in fact, some of the examples I will show you today are from Hinduism, and some are from Buddhism, because they are very similar and they borrow some of the same images. But it shows up in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and even, most surprisingly, in Islam. So the Islamic traditions in India also had a tantric variant. So Tantra is something that permeates all the major religions of India. Now, in Buddhist sense, we know that Buddhism kind of moved out of India, and so when you saw that map, let's go back to it, India is not a Buddhist country. There's not a lot of Buddhists in India. That's because the Islamic invasions into India pushed the Buddhists out, and they moved into Tibet, and they took with them the Tantric tradition. And so you will find Hindu Tantraism in India today, and you'll find Buddhist Tantra in Tibet and Nepal, Tibet and Mongolia, and these sorts of areas. But again, what the Hindu version and the Buddhist version are very similar. Also, it's worth pointing out, we taught a class on Hinduism where we talked about sex, sexuality, and the divine feminine, and we had a whole section on Hindu Tantra, as part of that lecture. So if you wanted to go look up all the things we've already said about Hindu Tantra, you can go watch that recording. It's on the YouTube channel, and it's also links to it in the webpage. And it'll give you the Hindu version of the same sorts of things we're going to discuss today. Now, what's interesting about all of these schools that we've described is you can see them as variations of the same forces that were moving in Hinduism. Again, this is an oversimplification, but this really helps my brain to wrap around the kinds of Buddhism we have. First, to describe the kinds of Hinduism. We started with Karmic Yoga. That was the Vedas. That was this thing that believes in reincarnation, so you perform rituals to appease the gods so that you can get good karma so you can have a better rebirth. That's the path of action, the Karmic Yoga. And at some point, Jnana Yoga evolved, and that's the way of wisdom. And the idea there is from the Upanishads, which is you meditate and you experience this realization that all things are connected in one cosmic consciousness, which again is how it differs from Buddhism. Buddhism, there is no self, and in Hinduism, everything is one self. We're all part of one grand consciousness. But they're all very similar in the rest of the ways. You can think of Buddhism as a sect of Hinduism, a non-traditional sect of Hinduism that changes this idea of self subtly. So in Jnana Yoga, you through meditation and through austerity, you go out, you give up society and you go out into a monastery and you meditate, or out in the wilderness, and you meditate until you experience that unity with the grand consciousness, and by so doing you escape rebirth. And that's Jnana Yoga. The problem, of course, is that a lot of people don't want to give up their lives, their family, but they still want to chase enlightenment. And so Bhakti Yoga develops as a form of a way of devotional Hinduism, where you worship gods and you hope that the gods will grant you enlightenment through your devotion, and you will experience your own sense of melding into the group consciousness through your devotion to a deity. So instead of meditating and realizing that you're one with everything, you devote your love to a deity, your faith to the deity, and by so doing, you feel like you merge into that deity and you lose your sense of self and you have a similar experience, but you don't have to give up all of your family and life, etc. And that's devotional Hinduism. And then Tantric Hinduism was the way of power. And it evolved within the way of devotion. But it added to the way of devotion certain rituals to transcend the difference between the pure and the impure, the good and the bad, etc., and to merge, and it helped you merge with this cosmic sense of unity by overcoming the sense of duality through ritual practice that granted power in this life, but also the experience of enlightenment. Now, that's the many paths of Hinduism. This is why so many Hindus will believe that it doesn't matter what religion you belong to. There's many paths up the same mountain. All religions are leading to the same experience. There's many ways to do it. Right? These are the different paths. All of them map onto a Buddhist tradition. The Karmic Yoga is very similar to the sort of thing that in the Theravada tradition, the Buddhists ask of the lay disciple. But the monks practice Jnana Yoga. Right? The lay disciple was going to gather good karma so they could have a better rebirth and they would pursue enlightenment in the next life. The monks were going to pursue enlightenment for themselves in this life through meditation and austerity, and by in the middle path of austerity, and by renouncing their material possessions and living as a monk. Well, that's the Theravada tradition, and that's Jnana Yoga, right? But at some point, that was hard, and people wanted, the lay people didn't want to just pursue karma and have a better rebirth. They wanted in this life to pursue enlightenment, and they started doing it through devotion. But instead of devotion to the Hindu gods, it was devotion to bodhisattvas and devotions to celestial Buddhas and Pure Land Buddhism, all the stuff we described last time. That is a Buddhist version of Bhakti Yoga, and it's the Mahayana. Or you can think of Mahayana as that sort of Buddhist version of Bhakti Yoga. And of course, as Tantra develops in India, a tantric variation of Mahayana also develops in India, and then of course gets pushed out into Tibet. And so all of the layers we saw of the Hindu tradition also show up in the Buddhist tradition, because Buddhism splits from Hinduism, but then it evolves with it, with many of the same phases at the same times. These happen at roughly the same time, in the same place, under the same impulses and movements of the cultures of India. All right. So what does Tantra mean, the word? Because we want to understand the meaning of the word so that we understand what it means. Well, one of the core meanings of the word is it's the warp of the threads, right? And so it's the thread that runs through a fabric and then and weaves reality together. So you can see it as the kind of core of reality is one way to think of it. But that definition of the thread of reality also runs into this concept of a text. The Tantra can sometimes be described as a corpus of texts. So what I have here is a Mongolian book manuscript. It's from the 19th century, so it's relatively late. But these things were a manuscript tradition for many, many years. Even after the development of the printing press, they were handwritten manuscripts. And they would write them sometimes on palm leaves and then later on, because they wouldn't use, skins usually. So they were written on these palm leaves and then later on paper. But they were sewn together by thread. And so there was a connection between Tantra and text. And so a Tantra can actually be now defined as a corpus of text. So the word has multiple meanings. There's a couple more we're going to go through. And which meaning was intended by the first users of the term is unclear. And that's okay. It has multiple meanings, and they all tie to the practice of Tantra today in Buddhism. Tantra can also mean, just like a corpus of text, it can mean a transmission of knowledge, probably by analogy from the corpus of text, I don't know. And so you get this idea of the guru, which is the Hindu, or the Indian term, or the Lama, which is the Tibetan term. So we have terms like the Dalai Lama. A Lama is a guru. A Lama is a teacher. And so the Tantric tradition is considered dangerous and possibly problematic, but incredibly powerful. So it's a powerful way of developing enlightenment, but it's a dangerous way. And so you must have a teacher who's been there before, can tailor the teaching to you and guide you through the path is the idea. And so the Tantric tradition is the tradition of the lamas. Sometimes it's even called, in the early kind of ethnographies where people would go to Tibet and come back and write things, for the West, they called it Lamaism, because it is the religion of the lamas, the religion of the teachers. You have to find a teacher. And we have all these wonderful stories in this tradition of students coming over to the teacher and begging the teacher to take them. And the teacher says, well, I'm only going to take people who are really serious about seeking enlightenment. So the teacher would, make them wait outside the door for days and days, begging to come in. Or they would make them, plow the field for them. And they would have to plow their field. So if you've watched the old Karate Kid movie, remember Paint the Fence? This is the tradition of the student and the teacher that is in here. If you've ever seen the new Marvel movies, Doctor Strange, this is I always, when I teach these, I understand that sometimes our cultural references seem trivial, but I like to see how these religious traditions have woven their way into our culture. And so in the Doctor Strange movie, you remember he goes to the Far East, and he's trying to get a teacher to teach him so that he can heal his damaged hands, to find the power to heal his damaged hands. You'll see that in the Tantric. And he goes and he finds this teacher, and she refuses to teach him. She shows him just enough to show him that she has the power, and then she kicks him out. And he waits outside her door for days and days, and finally she lets him in. Right? This is the very standard student-teacher stories we get from this tradition, from these places. Lastly, Tantra can mean power, specifically power that comes through the unification of the opposites. When you see through the delusions, you see through the opposites, you're supposed to be able to gain power over the elements, power to do things like make it rain, power to, in an earlier tradition we would have said power to appease the gods, but in this case it's power to actually use the mantras and their intrinsic power to change the world and to remake the world as you see fit. In other words, to heal Dr. Strange's hands, maybe, right, in that version of the tradition, but of our modern pop culture take on the tradition. But this is the idea. It's supposed to be a tradition of power. And so Tantra can mean those many things. It can mean the threads, the tradition, the book, the transmission, and a transmission of power. Power and enlightenment, but also power to actually do things in the world. So, Let me give you an example of this idea of power. This one is a rain-making ritual, and the way it works is, the lama or the guru or the magician will come, and you'll say, "I need it to rain because my crops are dying," and he will draw a circle, a sacred circle like a mandala, which we'll talk about in more detail. We've discussed before, but he'll draw this circle, and in the center of the circle, he'll put a cobra, because the cobra was seen in tradition as having control over rain, and then he would say a bunch of magic words, and I cannot say them, I can't pronounce them, and I've heard them, but if I try to pronounce them, I will slaughter them, and that would be worse than just not doing it at all. But you can imagine this room, boom, sort of, and you say these rituals, and you stomp your feet, and it's the power is in the mantra. And again, this comes straight out of the Vedic tradition. The Vedic tradition says that the words themselves of the rituals of the Veda have power, and so there's power in the sound. And you say it just right, and it actually influences the world. And if it doesn't work to bring the rain, then you say the whole thing backwards. And if that doesn't work, then may the heads of the cobras be split, and then surely that will bring the rain, right? So this is this tradition of power and magic, really. The difference between magic and ritual and liturgy, right? That's a better way to say it. The difference between magic and liturgy is often described as your religion versus mine. I do liturgy, you do magic. And it's a way to denigrate the other tradition. But I think if we wanted to define it in a different way, or find some sort of a technical definition that wasn't just denigrating another tradition, what you could say is magic is a technique of ritual performance that is intended to do something and make something happen in the world that you need physically. Whereas ritual and liturgy is something that's supposed to change your soul and help you connect to the divine. Now, every religion mixes the two, right? Because when you've lost your car keys and a Protestant prays and asks God to help him find his car keys, he's doing magic in that sense, right? But when he prays to connect to God, now he's doing liturgy, etc. So in this sense, though, it's a very magical ritual because it's a ritual designed through certain ritual and words and performances to affect the universe, in this case, to bring the rain. And so how does this power operate? Well, in the Vajrayana, it's an extension of the Mahayana, and it's a radical extension of the concept of emptiness. Now, we talked about this last time in the Mahayana, but this emptiness is this idea that everything is empty of a separate self, empty of a unique identity, because empty is always empty of something, right? And in this case, empty of a unique identity, of a separate self, etc. What Buddhist Tantra does is to radically extend that. Instead of seeing emptiness as kind of a nihilistic, there is nothing really here to live for, it's this idea that because everything is just an image without concrete reality behind it, it can be manipulated. It can be changed. And if you understand it and see it for what it is, emptiness, you can change it. And you can impact it, and you can remake the world in a different form. You can heal sickness, you can bring the rain. But it all requires a recognition of emptiness, so that through that recognition comes power, instead of just coming enlightenment. So again, it's this radical extension of emptiness into the realm of what we would describe as non-duality. Let me read this, and maybe this will give you an idea of what we mean. Those who do not perceive the truth think in terms of samsara and nirvana, but those who perceive the truth think neither of samsara nor nirvana. Discriminating thought is then the great demon. Remember, there was a demon, Mara, that tried to prevent the Buddha from achieving enlightenment. And for many of this, it's desire is the demon. Desire is the source of suffering. But here's discriminating thought. Discriminating thought is what tells you that this is good, this is bad. This is me, this is you. It creates that sense of self, which is itself an illusion. Discriminating thought is then the great demon that produces the ocean of samsara. Now, this is again, that ocean is that, remember we described that wave, the wave upon the ocean? An individual is a wave upon a larger ocean. that comes and goes and is born and reborn in the same ocean. The thought that I die isn't real because the wave doesn't really die. It just goes back to the ocean and then another wave comes. So it's the idea of the self that creates the idea of death. And the very idea of birth and rebirth comes out of this idea of discriminating thought, belief in a self. But being free of this discriminating thought, the great ones are freed from the bonds of existence, just as water that has entered the ear may be removed by water. I'm not sure exactly how they do that. And as a thorn may be removed by a thorn, so those who know remove passion by passion itself. Now that's a different thought. So we're going to talk about this in greater detail. Just as a washerman removes the grime from a garment by means of grime, I'm not quite sure what the laundry practice is here that they're referencing, but you can get the idea, right? You can imagine putting sand on something to rub out some sort of a stain. So the wise man renders himself free from impurity by means of impurity itself. What does that mean? Well, if discriminating thought is the source of the illusion of the self, there's me and you, good, bad, pure, impure, then if I can remove that entire concept, those constructs, if I can face those constructs and recognize them for what they are, just conventions, then the conventions can drop away and my sense of this is good, this is bad can drop away, and I no longer suffer. That's, I think, the idea. But to do that, we have to stop running from pain, from the impure, because as long as we're running from the impure, we're still participating in this version of discriminating thought. You see it? So you stop running from it, but you also have to be careful then, if you're going to do that, not to hurt yourself. This is why it's dangerous. This is why you need a lama and a guru, because these impure things can be dangerous. And so you've got to partake of them. The idea is to partake of the forbidden so that it's no longer forbidden, and in the pursuit of enlightenment itself. So here's this great image of someone using a thorn to dig out a thorn or a sliver that is in their foot. Now, my foot doesn't bend like that, but nevertheless, you get the idea. These are very beautiful from the statues at Kilimanjaro and these other temples. We've talked about those before when we did the Hindu traditions, but they're these wonderful, beautiful, and sometimes sexual images on this temple, and all of them are dedicated to this tantric idea of, instead of running from passion, using passion to recognize that enlightenment is already here. In other words, when you're and this is something that can actually work for people who suffer. Again, I'm not a practitioner of the kind of the rituals and the myth, etc., of this sort of thing. But there's something, I believe, in most religious traditions that does work. That's why they are promulgated and passed. And in this sense, the difference between the Theravada, the gradual enlightenment, where you slowly cultivate enlightenment and you get better and better every day, is that very concept discriminates between where I am now and where I want to be. And there is something about that moment of pain, and I've seen it in my own life, I've done it, right? And you're suffering and it hurts, and you have that thought, that I'm suffering, and then you have this realization, my suffering is coming from my discriminating thought. It's coming from me saying, I'm suffering and I don't like this. And suddenly I realize that there really is no difference between the suffering state and the non-suffering state. There really is a difference. But if you can kind of wrap your head around this idea, there is no difference except in my mind. And enlightenment is already here. It's not something I'm chasing. Pain-free is already here. I just have to look at the pain I'm feeling right now, and kind of transform how I relate to it in the midst of it. And the same is true of passion. In this case, desire, anger, sexual passion, physical pain. Instead of running from those things, you just embrace them and recognize that you can experience them without attachment, and you can experience them without suffering. So if you're a student and you're trying to learn this skill, the guru may actually cause pain. And the idea would then be to learn to experience the pain without additional suffering. Or you might be intentionally put in a position of passion And then the idea is to experience the physical arousal, to accept it, for it to be okay, instead of running from it, and then not be attached to it. So that you're okay if it's there, you're okay if it's taken away, and now you're in a state of equanimity, etc. So again, we'll see sexual references that will come up over and over again in this tradition as a means of enlightenment itself. And this is, again, removing a thorn by a thorn, or removing passion by the means of passion, or recognizing that there really is no difference between a passionless state and a passion-full state. And so to do that, among other things, they depict the Buddha in a very different way. Now, we're used to seeing the Buddha, sitting in peaceful divine meditation with his hand touching the ground and in overcoming the demons of confusion, etc., and in peace. And the recognition here is that enlightenment is present even in non-peace. And so here we have an angry Buddha. He's growling off and stick out his tongue half of them, and he's holding weapons, and he's often trampling a demon, and this image of wrath and passion, and then the idea, and often in sexual union. We'll see this in a minute. And in the midst of that, enlightenment is already here. Because it's the discrimination between that and the calm that is causing our disquiet when we're not calm. It's the distinguishing between the calm state and the non-calm state that makes us unhappy when we're not calm. And if we get rid of the distinguishing, the duality, then enlightenment, well, we can't say enlightenment comes, it's already here. Okay, you'll notice what they're borrowing from, though. If you remember back to my discussion of Tantra in Hinduism, on the right is Kali. And you notice around her neck is a string of skulls. And you'll notice the same thing here in the Buddha. He has a string of skulls. And skulls in his headdress, etc. And his eyes are wild. He has a third eye of enlightenment, and he's in that wrathful form. They're very much borrowing from this Hindu tradition of Kali. And we talked about why people might worship Kali and why they might have a desire to connect to the truth of the universe, that there is a wrathful side to the universe. That too is part of the universe. And all the universe is perfect as it is, so you connect to all of it, including the wrathful image. They're not just borrowing from Kali, though. You'll notice the flames around the wrathful Buddha very, very much look like Shiva. And in this case, Shiva is dancing on a demon. Right? And you'll see that this Buddha is often trampling on demons with the flames around him, just very, very much like Shiva. And so it's a mix of the Shiva image and the Kali image. And again, the Kali image was used in Tantric traditions in Hinduism, and now we have this wrathful Buddha equivalent in the Buddhist variation. But in this case, you'll notice this wrathful Buddha is in the midst of the act of sexual union. And so this time we have anger, we have passion, and physical passion as well, as part of this kind of depiction of enlightenment. This image is called the Yab-Yum, or the union of the male and the female, of course, which we saw in a less explicit version in the Vajrayana itself, right? Remember the bell and the thunderbolt? That was the male and the female. And in this case, we have this sort of meditative act of sexuality, where sexuality itself becomes a meditative act. There's lots of these depictions, often put in the center of mandala-like shapes and structures. Here's another one. Notice the trampling the demons while in the midst of sexual union, and then you have these kind of wrathful Buddha faces with the skulls in the midst of sexual union. There's another one. These are incredibly beautiful images, but they're also kind of scary. And like I said, they're often placed in the centers of mandalas. This is a 1490 painting of a mandala. And by mandala, we've talked about this before, but to remind it, it's an image of a circle. Mandala just means circle, but it's often a circle and a square, representing the heavens and the earth. And on the four corners, there will be four Buddhas who will sit at the four corners, and then there'll be a Buddha at the center as well. And what the Buddhas are will change from image to image and from tradition to tradition. So, what are we trying to unify all of reality itself, but specifically the pure and the impure by doing things that are impure. But also the male and the female, the compassion and wisdom, the Vajra and the bell, the semen and the blood, the consonants and the vowels, the sun and the moon, the subject and the object, the left vein and the right vein. The subject and those two veins, by the way, are thought of to run down the spine to the Kundalini. Remember we described that in Hinduism. And so there's two veins there. One is masculine, one is feminine, and they meet at the spine, at the base of the spine, in that kind of core part of our identity from which, that sexual release lets it go and it travels up the spine to the top of the head. You remember this image. All right. So the subject and object is a really important one, though, because I am the subject, I'm looking at you, you're the object, and in that distinction is the illusion of the self. So that is the core thing we're going to dissolve. And it is seen in the union of the subject and the object, the male and the female. And so in that depiction of the Yab-Yum, that sexual union, one of the things they're depicting is the union of the male and the female, but the union of the subject and the object. And it's in that union that the discriminating thought of me, you, yours, mine vanishes, and we are all one. So here's an image of the male and the female. This is a Hindu version of the same sort of thing. I'm using a Hindu version because, again, the Buddhist idea is the same, and this is the image I have. But it's got a bunch of triangles interlocking, and the red represents the blood, the menstrual fluid, and the white represents the semen of the masculine. And so by the union of the male and the female, with these deities each sitting on each of these petals, and at the four corners and at the center. And again, you have that same idea. So how do you use these things? Well, we've already described the sand mandala, right? You make it out of sand and then you sweep it away as a great lesson in impermanence. But the other thing you do is you use it in meditation, where you see the Buddha in the center and you visualize him arising. And you do this with mantras as well as visualizations. So you close your eyes and you think, Pom, and it has a color to it. And it's that sound, Pom, and you hear the sound, and then in your mind you visualize a lotus blossoming. And then Rom, and you visualize a solar disk, and then from that the Buddha arises out of the solar disk with all the 32 whatever it is marks of major and minor enlightenment, and he sits upon the throne there at the center of the mandala, and you visualize it. And through this practice of visualization, you also transcend the distinction between you and the thing you're visualizing, until you become one with the thing you're visualizing, and then you achieve enlightenment. So it's supposedly a very fast way of achieving enlightenment, because these visualization meditations are incredibly hard, but they're easy to do in a way that prevents distraction, because they take so much mental energy. To visualize and to hear, you've got to visualize the sound, you've got to visualize the color, you've got to visualize all the aspects, and you've got to see them. And my brain can only see one or two things at a time, but you've got to try to see it all at once. Keep it all in your head, the complexities of the mandala that you're visualizing, all in your mind at once, and you turn it all into one thing. So here at the mandala we have, the north, the south, the west, the east, the center, the cosmos, the earth, the heavens, the wheel of the heavens. This is the whole universe itself, and all of it is that center. And that center is all of it, and all of it is you as you visualize all of it, and then as you have that sensation of the subject and object dropping away, and you become one with the thing you're visualizing. Now that's a very common thing. People will look at a candle in pure concentration until they feel like they're one with the candle. The subject and object drops away. But in this case, you're visualizing something incredibly complex that represents the entire universe. And by using that universal representation and unifying your consciousness with that through intense concentration, you feel like all of the universe is one, and you are one with all the universe. And that's the goal, is to create that experience of unity with the universe through this intense mental process, which is very hard to do, and I can't do it. So, but practice, right? This takes practice. It takes effort. People work at it, and it claim that it creates a very powerful sense of enlightenment, and it does so very rapidly. But then, of course, the whole thing is swept away as a lesson in impermanence. We've described the mandala before, but in this case, we're talking about it in the tantric sense of emptiness and of unifying the subject and object duality. And then, of course, at the center, we will often have these Yab-Yum images of this sexual union. So this raises the question, how much of that was meant to be symbolic and how much of it is actually literal, especially the Yab-Yum, right? Well, most of the time, it's symbolic. So let's talk about the ritual and practice of Tantra. It involves mantras, these words, rum, pum, om, right? And you hear those and you meditate on those and you see them and you use them in your visualizations. So that's why it's called sometimes the mantra, the vehicle of the mantras. There's also these geometric patterns and symbols, the mandalas, that you visualize. So you visualize. There's not a really good word for this, auditorialize, but you visualize a sound, the mantras, and you visualize a pattern visually, the mandalas. And then there are gestures, hand gestures. These are the mudras. And then there's this idea of the mapping of the microcosm within one's own body to the macrocosmic elements outside. This is the idea that your body itself is a mandala, and then you have these different chakras, and the chakras represent points on the mandala, etc. And then you have this assignment of icons and sounds, and then you have this meditation, and then you have this ritual worship similar to puja, where you give offerings to the deity. You have intense secrecy and initiation rituals. You are initiated into a tradition by a teacher who gives you the secret teachings, and the teachings are intended to be secret. You don't pass them on without being part of the lineage and being an initiate. And then you have these ritualized sexual unions, and we know that happens, and we know it happens occasionally. How common it is hard to tell because a lot of these transmissions are secret. But we know that for a large number of these people, the image of the Yab-Yum is symbolic. It's a symbol of the union of the self and the subject and object. But we also know that in some versions of the transmission, there is an actual ritual of sexual union that's used as part of the initiation. So in those cases, what we're trying to do is to break down the distinction between the pure and the impure, and they do that by doing all sorts of expressly forbidden things. It's the controlled partaking of the forbidden in order to achieve enlightenment, and that includes things like wine, eating meat, eating fish, and this concept of sexual intercourse. So the way those rituals work, from what little we know about them, the sacred space is dedicated, a specific day is chosen. This isn't just something you do whenever you want. There's a ritual bath, dress, cosmetics, preparation, meditation, mantras. Couples form a circle around the guru, very much like either a mandala or a Mormon prayer circle, and the guru's partner who sits in the center. The female sits on the man's left, which is the traditional position of the goddess relative to the god. The mantras are pronounced and consecrated, and the elements are consecrated, to avoid pollution. The woman is sanctified as the goddess, and the sexual union becomes a form of worship and devotion to the goddess. They ritually consume the meat, the wine, and they end with a sort of sexual union. And each of these things are led by the guru in the center, and the couples around in the circle mirror his actions, his words, the mantras, his hand gestures, and then mirror the sexual union. So what's the purpose of this? Again, it's a reenactment of the cosmological union between Shiva and Shakti in the Hindu tradition. But the same thing, this is a reenactment of the creation moment, right? Shiva, remember I said this last time, Shiva without Shakti is a corpse, Shakti without Shiva is uncontrolled, bringing desires, and so the whole thing brings desires under control, etc. The dualism is transcended and appropriates the masculine appropriates the feminine, and the feminine appropriates the masculine. Direct desire towards, you are intended to direct your desire towards liberation rather than repressing them. So instead of repressing your physical desires, you use them and direct them towards liberation. Denying impulses only strengthens them, so we harness them instead. The ritual provides a structured context for indulgence in a way that avoids the harm that would otherwise come. And then we awaken the awareness of non-duality. There's no yes, no, good, evil, clean, unclean. And we awaken the awareness of body. We awaken that awareness bodily, not just intellectually. And And then then there's this idea of arousing the latent energy of the subtle body, or the kundalini, which we're not going to discuss in any sort of detail here, but you can go to the Hinduism lecture on the divine feminine to do that. So how does this kind of play out in life? Maitri Gupta is an example whose kind of life we can tell to give an idea of the difference between traditional Theravada worship, traditional Mantrayana and Vajrayana worship. So he was a monk who was studying at a monastery, and this is very much like an advanced university. They taught all sorts of things, right? They taught, math and science and medicine, and he was there studying for all his exams and seeking enlightenment. He went to the monastery to become enlightened. But he wasn't making much progress, and he had a vision where sort of a divine messenger came and said, "What are you doing studying here? What you need to do is go out into the wilderness and find Mountain Man." You gotta love that term, Mountain Man. So he blows off all his studies, skips his exams and wanders off into the wilderness. And he eventually finds Mountain Man. And Mountain Man says, "Please teach me." And they go through the whole, teacher-student thing, please teach me, please teach me. And finally Mountain Man says, "Okay, you want me to teach you? Go out, find yourself a rock. Sit on that rock for 7 days and don't eat anything. So 7-day fast, and then I'll teach you. And once you do that, come back to me with a understanding of enlightenment, and then I'll teach you." So Maitri Gupta goes out and he finds himself a rock, and he sits and he's bitten by mosquitoes and he's tempted to get up, but he perseveres, and he's looking for that sense of enlightenment. He's looked for it for so long in his life. He's willing to go through all sorts of suffering until he gets it. And on the 7th day, near the end of his sojourn, a wild woman, you can get this image of Kali, right? A wild woman comes out of the forest hunting a wild boar, and she kills the wild boar, and she takes a knife and she slices off a haunch of meat, and she brings it up to Maitri Gupta, and he says, "Here, eat. It's emptiness. Take this blood and drink. It is the eternal bliss." Maitri Gupta eats the flesh and drinks the blood and goes back to, again, very impure things, from the hunter to the female to the image of the flesh. You're not supposed to eat meat. You're not supposed to drink blood. But he eats this, and specifically, the flesh is empty. That's that concept of non-duality, right? There is no difference between the clean and the unclean, the pure and the impure. Eat it. It's empty. Drink it. It's the bliss of nirvana, right here in samsara, right here in the impure. It's nirvana right there. So he takes this story back to his teacher. He says, "Mountain Man, this crazy thing happened to me. I was sitting on the rock, and the woman came and she killed this animal, and I ate it and I drank it." And he says, "Aha, now you're ready to learn." And then they have an intellectual discussion about the meaning of emptiness and the fact that duality is the source of our delusion, and the fact that enlightenment is already here, right now, in the midst of samsara, in the midst of the impure. The enlightenment is already there, and he has this great experience. And you see in that all of it, you see that the concept of the need for a teacher and the need for personal experience that is core to this tradition, and this idea of touching the impure in a controlled and protected manner in order to realize that it's not really what you think, and thereby achieving enlightenment. So all of that is present in this story of Maitri Gupta. And so he is an example of how this plays out in a teacher-student experience. The other thing people are very familiar with that is related to this is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So, this is a complicated subject. We could spend a lot of time on it, but I just to give you a very brief idea of what we have here. The book is something people use in their own worship and meditation. And it describes the path of the deceased in the next life. And it's the mandala. And again, mandalas are these pictures of temples, and you circumambulate around. Normally you would circulate around, and you would picture the Buddhas all the way around, and you'd work your way into the center, just like Borobudur. I had that picture of Borobudur several classes ago, and we described this whole circumambulation, and then slowly working your way to the center as you circumambulate. You circumambulate, come in closer, circumambulate, come in closer, until you reach the center, and then you have that experience of the divine unity in the center. Well, the Book of the Dead describes the path of the deceased backwards from that. You start in the center, and you have this great experience of light. It's interesting how many people, describe the great light as part of their description of death. There's something goes on in the brain when we die that involves this kind of bright light. But you start there in that bright light, and you see the central Buddha, and you have a chance to be absorbed into that Buddha, to be absorbed into the unity with the universe. And if it's too scary, you fall out, and you work your way out. And you start experiencing the Buddhas around the circle of the mandala, working your way out in each phase. And in each instance you encounter the Buddha, you have a chance to be absorbed into the unity with the universe. And if that happens, you achieve enlightenment. And if it doesn't, you move on to the next one. And eventually, if it doesn't happen, you fall off the edge of the mandala, and you end up re-entering samsara and being reborn. And so, again, it's this description of the mandala as a picture of the cosmos, a picture also of the path of the deceased, and the opportunity to achieve enlightenment and not be reborn. And it mirrors what the practitioner does when he uses the mandala to try to achieve that experience of absorption. So then you almost see that meditation as practice for what will happen to you after you die. Because if you're good at achieving that absorption in this life through the mandala, well, when you experience it in the next life, you'll achieve enlightenment. You'll be absorbed, and you won't fall off the edge, and you won't be reborn into samsara. So that's the vastly oversimplified version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it does remind me of elements from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, although in that case there's no rebirth. But there is this version of passing one deity after another. But in that case, you're going in. So in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you're working your way from the outside in, trying to enter heaven. And you pass these deities, and you have to say, I'm worthy. I haven't committed this sin. I haven't done this thing, and I know your secret name. And they let him in. And then you pass the next one, and I say, I know your secret name, and I haven't committed this sin, and they let him in. And so you pass these deities one after the other until you reach the center, and then you're in heaven. And in this version, you start in the center after death, and you slowly work your way out. And if you don't absorb yourself into these deities as you encounter them, you move to the next until you fall off the edge of the mandala and you're reborn. It's very much a similar image to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but again, it's almost backwards to what you would expect in sort of these other Egyptian traditions. So this is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's interesting. It's worth reading. I don't actually know what the best translation is. I picked this one because it has a foreword by the Dalai Lama, so I assumed that meant it was a good translation, but it might not be. So we'll have to do some work to try to figure out what the best translation of the book is. And since I've only read one, it's hard to say what the best is. But let's talk briefly in the next maybe 5 or 10 minutes about how Buddhism moved with its Tantric traditions. Now, these Tantric traditions originate in India. We can see that because they're so similar to the Hindu versions, how they moved from India into Tibet. First, we have to talk briefly about what they found when they got there. There was an indigenous religious tradition called the Bon, and it's sometimes described as indigenous Tibetan shamanism. But it has a very shamanistic tradition, we think. If you find Bon worshippers today, they still exist, but they are so similar to Buddhism and yet so intentionally opposite of Buddhism because there's antagonism between the Bon tradition and Buddhism, so they intentionally do things backwards. You can see even the backwards elements as a reaction to Buddhism. You don't develop intentionally exact backwards traditions from another tradition unless you're reacting to that tradition. And so the difficulty is we don't know what the Bon tradition was like before Buddhism got there. All we know is what it's like now. And what it's like now is almost another sect of Buddhism with rituals that mirror Buddhism backwards. For example, they will circumambulate the opposite direction a Buddhist will. when you go around a temple, right? So this is the sort of thing we see. And they have these very fascinating ritual dances and the wrathful Buddhist masks. And so it's unclear who's borrowing from who, although those wrathful masks look a lot like Hindu traditions. So again, there's probably very complex lines of transmission here. One influencing the other, influencing one, and then passing back and forth from India to Tibet and back and forth. But this is the tradition that Buddhism encountered when it entered Tibet. And so it entered Tibet in two different diffusions. The first happened in the 7th century, so 600 BC, 600 AD, sorry, to 700 AD. But then in 836, a king called Long Dharma began to persecute Buddhism, and Buddhism kind of vanished. So Buddhism came in there, and there was an intentional desire to establish Buddhist monasteries and temples, and in fact there's a whole mandala. They turned Tibet into a mandala by building 5 temples, one in the center and at the 4 corners, and they also described that there was a demon there who was like preventing the monasteries from being built. This demon was probably associated with the bone tradition, right? And they had to pin down the arms and the legs and and then finally the heart. Those are the 5 temples that form the mandala, pinning down the demon and allowing Buddhism to enter Tibet. And then Buddhism is persecuted and basically leaves Tibet. And it doesn't leave completely, but falls away. And so then we have a second diffusion of the Dharma in the 11th century, where at this point, Buddhism is under attack in India. It's fleeing, and it flees into Tibet and then disappears in India. And we have this second diffusion of the Dharma. The second diffusion of the Dharma is fascinating because these worshippers who create the second awakening of Buddhism in Tibet, this one sticks, tie themselves to the earlier tradition because they want to feel like they're part of that early persecuted tradition. You can understand why they'd want to do that. They get to claim the persecution but also touch a richer, older tradition. The problem is they don't really have a direct line of transmission, and Tantric Buddhism is all about that line of transmission, right? So here's Jigme Lingpa, and there's a statue of him, and he is one of these famous kind of practitioners of the second diffusion of the Dharma into Tibet. And he has an autobiography, and in this autobiography he describes his own experiences in deep meditation. He claimed to be the reincarnation of one of the earlier monks who was famously involved in building all those temples and the 5 temples. So he tied himself to the first diffusion by being a reincarnation of one of them and then having visions of the second. Padmasambhava was one of the famous mythical almost characters from the first diffusion, and Jigme Lingpa claimed to see Padmasambhava in vision. And he would record what Padmasambhava taught and write it down in his own textual tradition. Now, there's something called terma, which means basically a treasure. Now, I really want to, write almost a paper on Jigme Lingpa, the Buddhist Joseph Smith. But Joseph Smith was a treasure seeker, and here we have seeking treasures. But the treasure is a text. And so the idea is to tie yourself back to this earlier tradition. Padmasambhava supposedly left, hidden around Tibet, all these books. They're secret, they're hidden, and they're sometimes written in characters that no one can read, and you've got to find them. And so Padmasambhava actually had a vision he would describe in meditation, where he was carried away into India, and he saw a major temple in India, and there he saw this text written by Padmasambhava, and it was in these characters he could not read. And finally a messenger came, very much like Moroni coming to Joseph Smith, and he gave him the key to translate these ineffable characters, and he translated them and dictated them to his students who wrote them down. And gosh, this sounds a lot like the Book of Mormon, complete with the whole treasure-seeking connection to it and everything, and out comes a new textual tradition. So this is something that shows up in religion all over the place. It's fascinating, and we get these kind of gurus who show up, produce new textual traditions by kind of this automatic writing or this kind of description of what they think they see in their mind's eye in these visions, and they're often in ineffable characters, and there has to be some sort of key to help you translate them. What's really important, I think, for us, though, is it tells us something about Tibet. Because here we have somebody tying himself to an ancient tradition. There's a respect for tradition here. There's also a scriptural tradition. There's a respect for scripture, for ancient books. There's a power in these ancient books, and they want to find ancient books. And so the canon is very much open. They're writing new ancient books. The irony there is, it's a new ancient book. But the reverence for the book is there, and the reverence for the personal experience is there. He has a personal experience that is written in this book that is supposed to be ancient. And so it connects this scriptural tradition with this tradition of personal religious experience. Just very, very kind of powerful and moving, and very much Vajrayana. This is Vajrayana, right? With its tantra, with its personal experience, with its textual traditions, and it's got its own canon, very rich and expansive canon of books. Most of them these sort of termas that were discovered, that are supposedly these ancient writings of Padmasambhava and these other earlier first diffusion saints. And so they're constantly finding new books of the saints. And the important figures in the second diffusion are the people who find these books and bring them up and add them to the canon. So, if you'd like to learn more, there's obviously the other lectures we've given on Buddhism. There's also the lecture in Hinduism on Tantra. We also have something of an annotated bibliography, which I will try to put that link. I don't expect you to write that down. I'll put that link in the video description if you go to and on the web page. So if you go to the course web page, you can get to that link to this annotated bibliography. And what I'm doing is I'm adding to it all the time, but it's got a collection of books you can read on different subjects, like how to meditate, the life of the Buddha, Buddhist teachings and doctrine, traditional Buddhist scriptures, and even a section on atheistic Buddhism, which is a modern kind of Western tradition that has evolved in the last few years. If you're especially interested in Vajrayana Buddhism, I highly, highly recommend Malcolm David Eccles' lecture from the great courses called Buddhism. A lot of what I've taught today I got from his lectures. Most introductions to Buddhism don't go into the different schools and traditions. He does. He talks about Bon, he talks about the Dalai Lama, he talks about using mandalas in the Vajrayana tradition, he'll talk about Tantra, and so he has a whole section on Vajrayana Buddhism and on the other schools that we've described, and the evolution of Buddhism after the Buddha and the monastic tradition and all this stuff. It's great. It goes into a lot of detail, but it's not inaccessible. It's an accessible introduction to these various schools, and that's all I have for Buddhism. Now, we are going to do, and I don't think it'll be next. I'm going to have to take a break to kind of clear my palate. We'll probably have a lecture on some sort of general religious studies topic, and then we're going to dive into Confucianism, Shintoism, and Taoism, and then we may circle back to one more lecture on Buddhism on Zen, but it won't be for a while. So this will be the last of our lectures on Buddhism for a while. We may circle back to Zen later, but we're going to have to go through China first and some of these other Chinese, Japanese earlier religious traditions that Buddhism then found when it got there. We know more about them than we do about Bon, so we're going to actually talk about them, and then we'll talk about maybe the Zen traditions and the other Buddhist traditions in China at a later date. So I am glad you're here. Thank you for coming. I hope to see you again, and I hope that some of what we shared helps you in your own journey and your own search for free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.